In 1965, a series of actions known as the Battle of the Ia Drang Valley were hailed in Saigon and Washington as the first major American triumph of the war. The helicopter played a central role in these actions, validating the effectiveness of air mobility in the war in Vietnam. The 1st Air Cavalry Division, also known as the CAV, arrived in Vietnam in mid-September of 1965. The division was confident and led by officers and NCOs who were strong believers in the effectiveness of air mobility.
The Air Mobile Division that goes over there is probably one of the best units that the U.S. has ever seen up to that time. Yeah, these are people who've been in the military for a long time. They're well-trained, committed, and they believe in the objective, hold the line against communism.
The cavalry division's men and helicopters were assigned to an old French airstrip near An Khê. There they rapidly established a base camp from which to operate. The CAV would not have long to wait for its baptism of fire. The enemy was well established in the mountainous area known as the Central Highlands. On September 18th, a battalion lost 4 helicopters and 3 company commanders when they mistakenly landed in the middle of an enemy bunker complex. Artillery and airstrikes were needed to break enemy resistance. On October 19th, just a month later, the Special Forces camp at Plei My came under heavy attack. An ARVN force that moved south along the highway from Pleiku to relieve the camp was itself ambushed. 1st Air Cavalry artillery was rapidly airlifted by helicopter into position, and its fire helped enable the ARVN to break through to the camp. For the next 35 days, the helicopters and men of the 1st Cavalry Division fought and pursued portions of 3 North Vietnamese or NVA regiments, using their artillery and aerial firepower to drive them out of the valley and into Cambodia.
Those operations that the CAV was performing in that first year that they were over there did a job on the 3rd NVA Division. The 2nd VC Regiment that was part of the 3rd NVA Division was virtually wiped out.
Despite significant American casualties, the Battle of the Ia Drang Valley confirmed to the American command the power of air mobility. It was the first of many battles that would lead to the conflict in Vietnam coming to be known as the Helicopter War. If any one piece of equipment were chosen to symbolize the American war on Vietnam, it would be the UH-1 Belle Iroquois, better known as the Huey, or Slick. Faced with a war that lacked front lines and an enemy who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere, the American answer was mobility and firepower. Nothing represented mobility better than the Huey.
Transportation now for the troops was by air, and 99% of the time it was by helicopter.
For the veterans, the sound of the helicopter still evokes memories of a now distant war.
I did finally sit through Apocalypse Now all the way from beginning to end, because always in the past, near the beginning of the movie, where an air cavalry unit launches an assault on a Vietnamese village, I'd always walked out of the movie during that because it was too close to home. It just, and even today, when I hear that music, and as soon as I hear that music start, I can hear the helicopters.
When the first American combat troops splashed ashore in Vietnam in 1965, all this was still in its infancy. The helicopter had been invented before World War II, but it was not until the Korean War that it found a place on the battlefield. In 1956, the Army sought to develop this concept of air mobility.
The air mobile concept, the use of helicopters on a large scale to conduct operations. Now this was conceived, again, as a way to deal with the high technology battlefield of Western Europe. The thought was helicopters would provide you with the maneuverability, the mobility that was required on the nuclear battlefield, where dispersion was seen as being especially important, and also concentration. So helicopters gave you this capability to rapidly disperse and concentrate forces.
However, military spending was focused on nuclear weapons, and money for conventional arms development was in short supply. It was not until President John F. Kennedy took office that the Army undertook extensive experiments with helicopters. Based on an enthusiastic report, the Army created an Air Mobile Division. Men and helicopters from all over the Army were ordered to Fort Benning, Georgia, to form the 11th Air Assault Division. Here, the new tactics were tried out in practice. In Vietnam, the difficult terrain and lack of roads confronted U.S. Army advisors with severe problems. The road-bound ARVN were vulnerable to ambushes, and the helicopters seemed to hold the key to countering guerrilla mobility. The American advisors began using supply helicopters to conduct ad hoc air assaults with ARVN units.
They had a program called Shotgun, and that was where we would send individuals over to fly in the helicopters that were supporting the Vietnamese, and they were door gunners with the helicopters. And at that time there weren't any, the helicopters hadn't really been configured to be a combative aircraft. It was strictly to move troops from one place to another. And the first machine gun was hung from a strap from the ceiling, and it was freewheeling. It was not a very effective system.
These early combat operations showed the vulnerability of the helicopters to ground fire. Each operation seemed to point out another area of air mobility which could be improved upon. Drawing on this combat experience and the extensive field testing done in the United States, the Army developed its air mobile doctrine that became standard in Vietnam.
Some of the tactics we were trained in was what called nap of the earth, flying low, and being able to navigate. We didn't have all this fancy stuff at that time we have now, like the GPS and inertial navigation systems and whatnot. It was strictly eyeball.
The organization grew and added scout helicopters, helicopter gunships for fire support, utility helicopters for assault landings, resupply, and medical evacuations, and heavier helicopters to deliver artillery and other large pieces of equipment to the combat area.
Probably what you would use a truck for, in most cases, they used helicopters for. I mean, the helicopters basically carried everything from troops to supplies to bodies back. Some of the missions we called over there was called Ash and Trash, where it was hauling ashes, victims. We had a regular resupply route. They carried mail back and forth, those kinds of things, as well as troop insertions. We had B-model Hueys that were equipped as gunships. Their job was to suppress an area before we went in with the rest of the flight.
What it did for the CAV is it gave the CAV an opportunity to cover a lot of territory. So it was a force multiplier in that respect. Another thing about the air mobility is it did a lot more for the troops. I think we might have had fewer casualties because we had more choppers to get guys out with.
Given the wide variety of roles helicopters were able to perform in Vietnam, they quickly became essential to U.S. efforts there. With our helicopters, we could run, but when it came to hiding, the enemy was usually the master. So American operations depended on reconnaissance, finding the enemy. The helicopter made its own unique contribution here, the Light Observation Helicopter, or LOACH.
And those guys would fly very, very low, like on the trees, under the trees, just above the trees, at some very, very low speeds, okay? 10, sometimes even hovering speeds, 10 miles an hour. So you can see. Now, can somebody hide from that individual? Sure. Those people got very, 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 very skilled at the place where they could follow trails, and so they could cover in 15 minutes sometimes what would take a ground unit maybe even a half a day.
Tolling for Charlie meant that the Loach crew was very vulnerable. To improve their odds when scouts were on the hunt, they were generally supported by gunships.
We were like sitting ducks. We went out to try to draw fire, and we flew at treetop level. And the unit that I was in, we flew two-man in the Loach helicopter. We had a pilot and an observer, and basically we were just out on recon missions. And if we did encounter the enemy, then we always had the firepower that was above us.
Armed helicopter gunships, known as guns or snakes, watched over and attacked anyone or anything found by the Loaches. Early on, these were other light helicopters equipped with rockets.
The difficulty with these early gunships, these first gunships, is that they lack the lift and the power necessary to carry enough armament, ammunition, and armor to make them effective, and their speed is also slow. So generally it's a great concept, but they're pretty ineffective.
In response, the versatile Huey was modified with machine guns and rocket pods.
Those were equipped with two M60s in the doors. Some of them had miniguns mounted on them, and then one M60, and some of them had rocket launchers on them. Those were the ones they affectionately called a hog because they barely stagger off the ground with the rocket pods mounted on them and a couple of machine guns, and then the smoke grenades and things they used to mark with. I mean, they were basically overloaded.
You had your issued weapon systems, and everybody modified the weapon systems to suit their own needs. And by the time we got done with ours, we carried 750 rounds. So you could just barely get it off the ground, but you were able to go and get the job done.
Other helicopters, including the Chinook heavy lift helicopter, were tried out as gunships. They had plenty of lift for weapons, but they were too big and slow to really fill the need.
We called them guns a-go-go. They worked in pairs, and they had 40 millimeter on the front. They had 20 millimeter. I think they had rockets. They had 50 calibers, I guess, out the sides and everything. But they were a lot of firepower.
As American involvement in the war went on and the need for armed helicopters was clearly established, the Cobra gunship was designed and fielded.
I'd seen movies of it in flight school, and I was smitten, if that's the word I could use. I wanted to fly Cobras. It was the sleekest thing I'd ever seen. It was a derivative from the Huey, the UH-1, same engine, the same transmission, different rotor head arrangement, but it was a very slim, trim bird. It was a tandem seater where one man sat in front, the other sat in the back, and it was designed strictly as a weapons platform.
Cobras worked out quite a bit around us, both while I was in the line company and mortars. And they were kind of fun to watch. I mean, they dive really fast, not like the jets, of course, but when you watch a Cobra salvo rockets, it looks like the aircraft stops in the air. I'm sure, obviously, it's got to be an optical illusion. Pretty scary if you're close to them.
A Cobra helicopter usually traveled in a 100 killer team. And the Loach would go in, mark the spot. The gunship would go in and drop armament on it, rockets, miniguns, whatever they had. And we came upon two teams of the two Cobras, two Loaches, and they were hitting this target. We were watching them for probably 15 or 20 minutes, just throw stuff at this. I mean, just death and destruction on this. We didn't see anything, it was just a spot.
In addition to their role in the hunter-killer team, gunships were used to prepare the LZ, or landing zone, for the troop carriers.
We'd have 4 gunships, 2 pairs, one on each side, and they would do a rotation, and it was designed so that the gunship that was on a firing run, shooting miniguns and rockets on our flank to keep the enemy's heads down, as soon as one pulled out, then the other one would be pulling in, and they would continuously keep the landing zone suppressed so that we could land and offload the troops and then get out.
When we were being inserted, the gunner on each side, the gunners would be firing into the tree lines, and you'd have some Cobras firing. Also, there were miniguns and rockets to keep us safe.
This responsive, effective support often made the difference for hard-pressed Allied forces. The ability to react quickly, no matter what the terrain, was vital. In response to this requirement, special units of helicopters were formed known as air cavalry.
Each Cav troop had the scout platoon, which was the Little Birds scouts. Up north, we had Hughes 500s, what they were called at the time, OH-6s. Had a gun platoon. We had AH-1G Cobras, and then a lift platoon, which was the UH-1H Hueys.
Also, each Cav troop had their own platoon of infantry. Integration of the helicopters with a dedicated air-mobile cavalry element gave the Americans a huge advantage. If the ground force got into trouble, then the helicopters could quickly pull them out.
When it was hot, there was firepower available, phone call away. And if you needed out, you get the firepower and you could get extraction.
Where there were no LZs, the helicopters had to find a way of extracting the troops from the air.
If we were extracting a team, what we'd do is we'd come over the hole in the jungle, throw the ladder out, and then the recon team would climb up on the ladder, and then they had a D-ring that they'd use to hook into a rung of the ladder, and then we'd lift them up out of there and then go someplace that was secure and set down and let them off the ladder. The McGuire rig was a rope, and it was tied in the bottom of the aircraft, and it basically went down and had a strap in it, and the team member would sit in the strap, and we would lift them out. And they had a couple of cases where they had people get wounded and fall out of them, and so they later changed to what's called the Stabo rig, and it had the soldier on the ground had a harness that was part of his web gear, and the Stabo rig would snap into that harness on his web gear, and it was a lot safer.
Eventually, America developed a fast way to create landing zones for helicopters. These were the Daisy Cutter bombs. A parachute stabilized these huge bombs as they dropped. Set to go off just above the ground, they blew down the trees and created a landing zone for Hueys to land troops. Air mobile operations became widespread throughout Vietnam as American forces sought to bring the enemy to battle. By the end of the war, virtually every American unit had participated in some way in air mobile operations. While no other division was as equipped with helicopters as the 1st Air Cavalry, helicopters could be assigned as needed from independent helicopter units. The first stage of an air mobile operation would be the detection of an enemy force by small light observation helicopters, or loaches. The idea then would be to suddenly surround the enemy using the mobility of helicopters before he could get away. If there were not already fire bases within range, GIs would quickly establish fire bases nearby the suspected enemy position. Then would come the artillerymen and the artillery itself. You can't move a 105 millimeter howitzer in a Huey. but a CH-47 Chinook has no problem with it. Down would come artillery pieces, pallet loads of ammunition, sandbags to protect the position, and perhaps even a big sky crane would be enlisted to carry in particularly heavy equipment. When the fire bases were established, in would go the air assault. Heavily loaded grunts would line up at pickup points, waiting to be transported by Huey to LZs surrounding the enemy on several sides. First, the gunships would dive in, spraying the LZs with fire.
Yellow smoke, 200 meters, automatic weapons, over. This is 2-1, no sweat, got you covered. Okay, we'll stay trail. Shaw, you got them? Request 9, you start your firing fast. Okay, we're starting firing fast now.
Then the Huey Slicks would descend line after line, door gunners blasting the area around the landing zones. As soon as the Slicks touched down, the troops took up positions along the tree lines. Overhead, the guns would be orbiting, watching for opposition. And above it all, in the command and control, or CNC helicopters, would be the watchful eyes of the officer commanding the operation. The grunts now on the ground would then try to sweep the enemy toward a blocking force. Wherever the enemy stood and fought, they would be pounded by gunships and artillery. Meanwhile, the Loaches overhead would watch to see which way he ran, while Hueys would shuttle back and forth, bringing in reinforcements and supplies. Medical evacuation helicopters, or dust-offs, would carry American wounded back to aid stations. Heavy lift helicopters would fly out carcasses of any helicopters that had been shot down during the assault. The backbone of these air assaults, and indeed of the whole American helicopter effort in Vietnam, were the troop carriers. The Huey rapidly assumed this role throughout Vietnam. Initially designed as an aerial ambulance, the Huey was quickly recognized for what it was, an exceptional multi-role helicopter.
The Army was really lucky that Bell makes a heck of a helicopter. It's kind of a Mack truck, so if you could start it, it'd fly.
It was designed originally in the late 50s or early 60s to transport wounded. But it was just a fortuitous design that once it was put in service, that it was found to have much greater application.
Initially, the A models were sort of a experimental aircraft as far as the UH-1 series was concerned. And the B models, which had the larger engines, the L9 engine, which was 900 shaft horsepower, that was used for, it was designed primarily as a people carrier. And that meant staff or troop transport or whatever. And then later on, as the improvements in the aircraft evolved, then it was converted to, or weapon systems were attached to it. Rocket systems, or the XM6 system, which was 2 M60s on each side. And also it served as Medivac, but basically it was designed as a people hauler.
Like any military operation, air assault operations ran into unexpected situations and setbacks when put into practice on the battlefield. When a unit met opposition in an air assault, the carefully planned operation could rapidly become chaos. At times, problems might arise before the helicopters even touched the ground.
They were forever taking pot shots at the helicopters, and even the guy flying it was amazed. He told us he was in a Cobra, and I guess it was the first Cobra they saw. He says, "You're not going to believe there's somebody shooting at me with a pistol," and the Cobras could shoot, I think it was 15 degrees from horizontal, backwards, basically, 15 degrees off the horizontal thing. So, yeah, they got that guy good, too.
The ones that were smart, would jump out in front of the helicopter because the M60s on a slick have a stop and they can't, cover directly in front of the helicopter. And, that was pretty hairy sometimes.
We were out in this helicopter, and we were headed down to the Rome Plow. So it's a forest. There's this huge strip out of it, and they flew right down into the strip. So there was like jungle or forest on each side, and we were going down the strip. When you have the gun, what you do is you sit on the edge of the helicopter with your legs hanging out, with the gun across your lap, because you're the first one out. Because on a hot LZ or whether you're drawing fire, first thing the gunner's supposed to do is jump out, get down, and start laying down a base of automatic fire. So I was out there, I was sitting on the edge of the helicopter with my legs out, right behind the pilot seat, with the gun across my lap. And we're cruising through, and I didn't hear anything. It's noisy, you can't hear anything, the wind blowing in the helicopter. And then the door gunner says, well, we just drew fire, and we took like 3 rounds in our ship.
The noise of the chopper blades more or less drowns out any shots or anything like that. There may be firing on the ground, but for the most part, you don't know it until maybe a round might pop off the side of a chopper that you're in. So in that sense, noise is a blessing.
It used to be kind of a joke that as soon as, Charlie or the VC figured out that they needed to lead the helicopters a little bit like a duck when you're duck hunting, we'd be in trouble, but they'd shoot straight at it and usually behind it. But they got better as time wore on. The problem with the helicopters going into the PZ or the area touchdown zone or whatever was that they were low and slow and made excellent targets. And in the hovering and the jockeying around and when you get 10 helicopters landing in one area, there's so much rotor wash all over the place that everybody's trying to find out where the ground is and get set down. And the whole idea is you don't really want to be there, so the idea is touch the ground and get everybody out and move. So it's a bit of a challenge, but that's when you're most vulnerable.
Probably the weapon most feared by helicopter crews was the Soviet-made 12.7 millimeter machine gun, equipped with special sights for shooting at airplanes and helicopters. Just as dangerous was a captured .50 caliber machine gun in enemy hands. Here, captured weapons are shown to an Air Force officer by a sergeant of the Air Cavalry. It was impossible to plan for every problem that might face an air assault force. The biggest and most difficult to anticipate was the level of opposition the troops might find waiting for them once they were on the ground.
There was an enemy contact out northeast of Bongsan, and they were putting companies in to, block this force. They put B Company in, and then the choppers came back to pick us up, and one chopper was coming straight back into the pickup zone. And this chopper got to the PZ and just almost pancaked in, just hit the ground, and the fuel was coming out. The door gunner kind of slid off the chopper and had a big, pants were ripped and obviously had a gunshot wound in his thigh. And I looked at that, and boy, I tell you, even with a helmet on, my hair stood on end, And what had happened was B Company hit a hot LZ.
We were inserted by helicopter into a rice paddy, and we crossed through a wooded area and entered into another rice paddy, and all of a sudden we received automatic fire from the wood side in front of us. Of course, everybody scattered and were advancing, and I stayed in the middle of things. Of course, running and diving as you normally would, good old same thing as you see in the movies. But with all of the fire and all of the incoming and outgoing fire, it was like my mind focused in on one gun in particular. And they were short bursts of probably an AK-47. And it was like every short burst was coming in my direction. And it was like a direct command to dive behind this rice paddy. And as I dove, that bush right above my head was cut down.
They would tell you, expect a hot LZ or don't expect a hot LZ, and so on. And a lot of times, on a lot of those, as we would go into, maybe we're not the first wave down. We're only like a couple times that we were the first ones on the ground. So we might know going in that the LZ's secure. So, but you're kind of looking for where's that place to duck.
You would be choppered to an LZ where, for the most part, they say it's safe, but you don't know for sure. And then from there on, you don't know if you're going to confront a full-scale firefight or not. You just get to cover, and you have one job: get out of the chopper and run.
This is going down into an LZ that they told us wasn't hot. They said there's a division of VC out there. Yeah, right. You know, that LZ was hot. That was the hottest LZ I've ever been in. I mean, shit was flying. Felt like motors was dropping in because bombs was going off. I didn't know if it was ours or theirs. The lieutenant called over the radio. He said, "You're in a hot LZ. You know, get a security force out there quick." Well, I think I tried my damnedest to get the squads out there, and we pretty much did what we could do, but we were taking too many woundeds too quick, too fast. We didn't know where they were coming from. All we did was it's like shooting in the blind, shooting in the bush, and that's all we did. And I was talking to the lieutenant most of the time, you know, that we need some force down here, you know, faster than what we're doing right now. And the lieutenant, he got these helicopters to land, and by the time the rest of the troops came in, you know, we pretty much kind of settled down to take care of our woundeds, and that was the first time I lost direct men to firefight, and like I had 4 of them were killed.
In the confusion of combat with an enemy force, firing between American forces could happen. So-called friendly fire is always an issue in military operations.
They were inserting another company, rice paddy away, and of course there's gunships along. And they knew we were there. They asked for us to pop smoke to identify our location. Well, whenever they had red smoke located, that was the location of enemy fire. They would locate us, we would pop a yellow or green or purple or whatever, and they would identify our color for our location on the radio. We were out of any color except for purple. I don't know if the helicopter pilot was colorblind or what. And all of a sudden, here comes the Huey with its miniguns on the side, and all of a sudden, the dirt in front of us just, you know, it was like a freight train coming towards you. This was getting plowed up. He opened fire on our location, thinking that our purple smoke was red smoke. There was a deep water hole behind me. As soon as I saw that, you know, the ground being churned up by the miniguns, as I just dove over backwards into the water, and guys dove in all different directions. The ground right where we were, where all of us were, was chewed up. If we hadn't had the time to dive out of the way, I wouldn't be here today.
The B Company FO was adjusting a white phosphorus round as a marker for Spooky. And the white phosphorus round landed right on our perimeter instead of in the area where the enemy force was believed to have been. And my radio operator was alert. He was on the battalion net, and he immediately started yelling into the radio, "Call off Spooky, call off Spooky." And I can remember looking up and seeing that. It was dark, it was at night, but you could see the lights on that C-47, and you could see him in that turn, just waiting for him to start hosing us down, because if they'd have done that, we'd have had a lot of casualties.
We were laying in ambush one night, and about 3 o'clock in the morning, an outfit come over. We were in 3 Corps, and supposedly they knew we were there. But anyway, outfit came over called Firefly, and it consisted of a couple of Hueys with 12 arc lights on the bottom of them. So they lit the area up like Luna Park, and just shot the hell out of the place. And we ended up with nobody was hurt real bad. It was amazing. But one of the guns they were using was a 20 millimeter and had explosive warheads on it. And they were going off above our heads. They'd hit the bamboo and go off. So we had a lot of minor wounds. I had one in the heel, and the team commander who went on the operation, he got hit in the calf. And the rest, and we shut off all our flares, and they just kept shooting, so we surrendered. Troops, so help me God. We took our shirts off and stood out there with our hands up. And the guy landed, and the line that we got was expected. He said, "Hey, you guys are Americans." I said, "Mm-hmm, we knew that."
One way in which American forces sought to overcome the confusion inherent in these operations was to establish a command and control helicopter.
What you would have is maybe your commanding officer, he would be in what we call the CNC ship, command and control ship, and he would be up maybe quite a ways up in the air, and he would basically coordinate the insertions.
So he was in communication with his team on the ground, and then of course all of the helicopters' radios, you can overhear the conversation, so everybody knows what's going on. Even the crew members, the door gunner and crew chief know what's going on because they're listening to the radio communication.
In the event a helicopter was forced down, great effort was taken by American forces to recover and repair these valuable machines.
We had just taken off from the flight deck, and we were catching up to the other helicopters. There was 3 in front of us. And we're just going along as normal. And all of a sudden, I kind of noticed that the other helicopters are way ahead of us. We had caught up to them. And I didn't hear anything, I didn't feel anything as abnormal. But I turned around and looked at the gunner, and he just smiled and went like this. We were going down. We had lost the power.
And so they called us and said, could we send some troops out there to guard the helicopter until they could get a repair crew in there to either fix it or pull it out.
They went down through the triple canopy, and we had what we called a bright light team. It was a reaction team standing by, and I inserted them in, and as close as I could, and they had to fight through the jungle. And they got the people out.
You would get out there just as soon as the smoke had cleared, just about, to pick these things up. And helicopters were blasted out of the sky with small arms sometimes. They're all different kinds of things. All it would take is one round in a transmission and freeze it up, and the helicopter flop just drops. I mean, when the main rotor stops, that helicopter is a big piece of lead.
One of the things that the maintenance folks did in the last 11 months that I was there was we'd fly either command and control or standby for downed helicopters. Somebody had a maintenance problem, we would go with the rest of the aircraft to the staging area and sit, and then the other aircraft would go off and do the mission, and we'd wait. And if somebody had a problem, they'd call back. We'd either go pick up a down crew or go fix something that needed to be, if it could be repaired on site.
So they would be in all conditions, from just holes, and sometimes there would be nothing even left that we knew would not be salvageable, and that was pretty much left there. But anything that looked, that was anything of any value at all to it, we'd go down there and kind of clean it up, throw pieces in what we could into the Chinook.
They brought them all back, and we used to scavenge as many parts as we could if the machine was unrepairable. Put the rest of it in the box and mail it back to Texas for a refund, so on the warranty. But
Pulling damaged helicopters and planes out of the jungle was not all that heavy lift helicopters did. They were also the prime movers for the air mobile artillery that was the backbone of the Sky Troopers' fire support when they were on the ground. They also moved large amounts of cargo, heavy equipment, numbers of people, and at times had the grisly task of removing the bodies of the dead, both friendly and enemy. But evacuation of downed aircraft or moving supplies was not nearly as important as the vital task of evacuating wounded Americans. This was the work of the medical evacuation, or medevac helicopters, known as dust-offs. In Korea, helicopters had first made a name for themselves evacuating wounded Americans. The use of helicopters in casualty evacuation would dramatically increase the survival rates of those wounded in Vietnam.
At that time, the average wound to hospital time was like 17 or 18 minutes. That was amazing.
All the helicopters in Vietnam is what kept our casualties, limited our casualties to only 56,000 people.
The effectiveness of the dust-offs was enhanced by the communication between those on the ground and those in the air.
Sometimes the dust-off people would be alerted through a CNC ship. You might even have a CNC ship above you that would actually take care of contacting the dust-off pilots. But quite often it was you that was having to call a land-based radio operator that would in turn get the people airborne. Once the man was airborne, he would have our frequency, or sometimes we would be given his frequency. Many times, especially at night, you would direct dust-off pilots in by mere sound. You could tell that they were to your south or they were to your right. You'd let them know that they were approaching, that they just flew over. You would communicate as to whether or not you're going to pop a smoke, whether or not you were going to pop a flare, and of course at night, most of the time, strobe light.
Sometimes they got there too quick, and we'd have to wave them off that I'm not ready for them to go, not ready to go on. They'd get there within 10, 15 minutes, and they would land in almost any conditions, taking incoming fire, and we're carrying a guy out under fire with bullets whizzing around us, and they would land that thing. And boy, you got to give them a lot of credit. I could duck behind something. You know, if I felt some incoming fire, what can you do sitting in a helicopter? You're there. And you not only have to have the talent for the pilot to land in very difficult, tight areas at times, and then you've got the medics, corpsmen on the helicopter. That's complete dedication.
These were men that had to come in and extract wounded individuals at a point in time when violence was at its peak. Men had to be extracted in a timely manner for it to really benefit. And it meant life or death many times. Quite often, I would literally tell these pilots that this area is not only not secure, but I don't think that you probably should put your bird down and be jeopardizing your life, although my friend's probably going to die. if he isn't out of here shortly. 99% of the time, it made no difference to these men. They were coming in, and you just had to do the best you could do to help them.
If you flew dust off just about every time you pulled pitch, you were going to the war because somebody was wounded or some buddies were wounded. And very often, almost always, up where we are, you're talking about enemy units in contact. You're not talking about some one-shot Charlie on an edge of a runway with an old M1 rifle taking pot shots at people. 9th NVA Regiment, 11th NVA Regiment, these were pretty standard combat formations. These people knew how to fight. They knew how to shoot down airplanes.
It was not a safe or easy job going unarmed into often intense enemy fire, and it cost the pilots a lot, physically and emotionally. However, despite the sacrifice, the rewards of the job linger with the pilots even today.
I've never forgotten that when I landed at the field hospital, I was just sitting there as they were unloaded. I'd called ahead, and of course the medical facilities were completely prepared to take care of these people when I landed. But I've never forgotten when I was sitting there as they were being unloaded, and I felt someone pulling on my sleeve, and I turned around and looked down. We had the light on inside the helicopter then. And one of these guys who was laying on the floor had reached up and was pulling on my sleeve. And he was trying to say thank you. I couldn't hear him, but I could see his mouth moving, saying thank you.
The end of the war in Vietnam did not mean the end of the helicopter on the battlefield. However, while Vietnam firmly established the importance of the helicopter in military operations, it also showed their vulnerability to effective ground fire. So tactics and weapons were developed to suppress enemy fire and make helicopters more survivable.
A helicopter is inherently a very vulnerable piece of machinery. It doesn't take too many hits in the right place to bring one down. During the course of the Vietnam War, there were many operations that saw many score helicopters go down from damage or just shot to pieces in the air. But in 1971, the ARVN, in what was to be a showpiece of Vietnamization's success, invaded southern Laos. They went in to cut off a junction on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They were supported by a lot of American helicopter support. And the North Vietnamese reacted rather quickly. The ARVN pushed their way in, but getting out was nowhere near as much fun as the North Vietnamese brought in tanks, artillery, and infantry. And with them, they brought a lot of anti-aircraft cannon, light guns. As a result, over 600 helicopters were shot down during the withdrawal. And as a result of this, the United States Army had to take a long, hard look at the role of the transport helicopter in battle.
The real concern the Army has is what will helicopters be able to do in a more intense anti-aircraft environment. And so the Army puts a great deal of time and effort and research and development money into hardening the helicopters, armoring the systems, the rotor systems, the crew positions, making the helicopters faster, making them more able to operate in low visibility or at night, making them able to follow terrain, increasing the ability of the crews to effectively use these helicopters in a more mid-intensity or high-intensity war situation. And this leads to development of helicopters like the Black Hawk model, which will become the new troop-carrying helicopter, and the Apache gunship, which is a quantum improvement over the Cobra. At the same time, the Army is developing tactics like SEAD, or suppression of enemy air defense to allow for the employment of helicopters. The different ground units are being trained in how to spot, locate, and eliminate enemy air defense weapon systems so that the helicopters can then come in and engage the enemy.
For the pilots who flew their fragile machines in the skies of Vietnam, all this was still in the future. Those men brought away from the war memories of the camaraderie, courage, and sacrifice of the soldiers of the helicopter war.
I think the fact that we all flew together, worked together, we're a family together, we took care of each other very well, and that always paid big dividends. And everybody knew, everybody had the confidence that if we went down, there was going to be somebody, our wingman or somebody was going to go take care of us.
We have a saying that, we've kind of adopted, and it's, brothers then and brothers forever. And it's, it's a lifelong, friendship that just, is unbeatable. It just, it's a camaraderie that, you just can't explain. I think when you go and fight for your life with somebody and, come under enemy fire and return fire and are successful and, by successful save yourselves from being killed, there is a bond that develops.